They smashed a disabled girl's crutches. One biker made a call, then 200 Hell's Angels arrived. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge behind Riverbend when Ellie Marsh opened her eyes. Gray light seeped through the thin curtains, falling across the walls of her small bedroom. Those walls held her whole world. Photographs, dozens of them, taped and pinned in no particular order. Her mother laughing on a porch swing, her dark hair caught mid-air. Her father, younger, leaner, squinting into the sun with his arm slung around a motorcycle she never knew the story of. Her parents together at a lake, foreheads touching, unaware anyone was taking their picture at all. Ellie looked at them the way she did every morning. Not long, just enough to remember they were real. She sat up slowly. The mattress creaked beneath her, the same complaint it made every day, like an old friend clearing its throat. Her legs already ached before she moved them, a dull throb that lived in her bones no matter how she slept. 3 years now. Long enough that the pain didn't surprise her anymore. It just arrived, like weather. She reached for the crutches leaning against her nightstand, metal cool under her palms as she gripped them. The morning routine had become choreography. Weight on her right leg first, always, because her right leg forgave her. Then the careful swing of her left. Then the crutches following like extensions of her own arms, a rhythm she'd learned so well she barely thought about it anymore, though there had been a time, right after the accident, when every single motion had to be relearned like a foreign language. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story she remembered that time only in flashes. Hospital ceilings, Aunt Ruth's voice, tired, and trying so hard to be strong. Her mother's absence, sitting in every room like a held breath. Ellie stood, balanced herself, and made her way to the small dresser across the room. She dressed the way she did everything now. Quietly, efficiently, without wasted movement. A gray hoodie. Jeans that hid the brace on her left leg. She had learned that the less anyone noticed her, the easier the day went. Attention was a spotlight, and spotlights made people cruel. She had learned that lesson at school more times than she could count. Downstairs, the house smelled like burnt toast, which meant Aunt Ruth was already up, moving around the kitchen with her usual tired devotion. Ellie made her way down the stairs one careful step at a time, crutches thumping softly against the wood. "Morning, sweetheart," Ruth said, not turning from the stove. Her voice had a permanent rasp to it these days, worn down by worry and by years of just getting by. "Morning," Ellie said back. They ate in a comfortable quiet. Ruth asked about homework. Ellie said it was fine. Ruth asked if she needed anything for school. Ellie said no, though she knew Ruth would have found a way to get it, even if she'd said yes. That was the shape their life had taken since her father died 8 months ago. Small kindnesses stretched thin over an ocean of grief neither of them said out loud. The walk to school took 11 minutes if Ellie kept a steady pace, which she always did. She had memorized every crack in the sidewalk, every place the pavement dipped and threatened to catch a crutch tip wrong. She moved through Riverbend like a ghost who knew the layout of her own haunting. By the time she reached the school steps, the halls were already filling with noise. Lockers slamming, laughter, sneakers squeaking on linoleum. Ellie kept her head down and her eyes forward, the way she always did, letting the current of students part around her like she was a stone in a stream. She felt the stares anyway. She always did. The whispers were quieter. but no less sharp. She caught fragments as she passed, words not meant to reach her but landing anyway. Across the hallway, she saw them. Braden Holt leaned against a locker, his Letterman jacket too big for the boy underneath it, his friends clustered close, phones already halfway out of their pockets. He caught her eye and smirked, nudging the boy beside him. Snickers rippled through the group. The first bell rang, sharp and metallic, echoing down the hall. Ellie kept walking. Across town, the metal door of Delgado's custom cycles rattled up with a sound like thunder waking from sleep. Marcus Tank Delgado stood beneath it, one hand still on the pull chain, watching the morning light spill across the concrete floor of his shop. Dust floated in the beams like tiny gold flecks. The smell hit him the way it always did. Motor oil, rubber, metal shavings. It smelled like home. Tank was a big man, built like something out of an old story. 6'4", shoulders wide as a doorway, arms roped with muscle earned from decades of turning wrenches. His beard had gone gray at the edges, though his eyes stayed sharp, dark, and watchful. Faded tattoos climbed both forearms, a road map of a life most people would never understand just by looking at him. A skull here, a rose there, a name inked over his heart that he never showed anyone, not even the men who rode beside him. He moved through the shop with the same quiet rhythm he brought to everything. Flip the lights, check the register, line up the tools on the pegboard, each wrench and socket in its place, because a place for everything meant nothing ever got lost, and nothing getting lost meant nothing ever got forgotten either. The back door creaked open, and Doc Rivera shuffled in, a steaming thermos in one hand and a grease-stained ball cap pushed back on his head. "You beat me here again," Doc said, setting the thermos down on the workbench. "One of these days I'm gonna show up before you and ruin your whole morning." "Doubt it," Tank said, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. It was as close to a smile as he gave most mornings. Doc laughed, low and easy, the laugh of a man who'd known Tank so long that silence between them felt like conversation. He'd been the club's medic once, patching up busted knuckles and worse things out on runs nobody talked about anymore. Now he just fixed motorcycles and kept an eye on his oldest friend, which some days felt like the harder job. The bell over the front door jingled around 9, and an older woman walked in pushing her bike with a flat back tire. Tank crouched down beside it without a word, turning the wheel slow between his big hands, checking for the puncture. He found it fast, patched it faster, and waved off half the payment she tried to give him. "Just get home safe," he told her, voice low and steady, the kind of voice that made people feel like maybe the world wasn't so bad after all. The day rolled on the way most days did. A truck needing brake pads. A teenager on a beat-up scooter asking if Tank could look at a chain that kept slipping. Tank worked with the same care on every job, whether it was a $5 fix or a $500 overhaul. Doc handled the register and the phone, cracking jokes that made the customers laugh even when they came in stressed about their cars. By the time the sun started sinking low over Riverbend, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, the shop had gone quiet again. Doc had left an hour before, calling out a goodbye that Tank answered with a raised hand and a nod. Tank moved through his closing routine, methodical as ever. Wiping down the counters, locking the tool cabinets, counting the register twice, because once was never enough. He reached into the bottom drawer of his old metal desk to grab the ledger book, and his fingers brushed against something stiff and worn at the edges. He pulled it out. A photograph, curled slightly from age. The colors faded into soft yellows and blues. Two kids stood in front of an old Chevy, squinting into the sun. A younger Tank, maybe 17, skinny in a way that seemed impossible now, grinning wide. Beside him, a girl no older than 14. Dark curls framing a face full of light. Sophia, Tank's chest tightened. He sat down slowly on the stool behind the counter, the photograph trembling slightly in his thick fingers. He remembered the funeral. Rain that day, though nobody could recall it actually raining. Just gray skies and gray faces and a small white casket that seemed too small for the size of the grief surrounding it. He remembered standing beside his parents, 16 years old, feeling like the ground had opened up and swallowed something that could never be replaced. He remembered the whispers afterward. Kids at school who'd been cruel to her, suddenly quiet, suddenly ashamed, though shame never brought anybody back. Tank set the photograph carefully back in the drawer, closing it slow, like closing it any faster might hurt something. He stood, flicked off the lights, and locked the front door behind him. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a fresh bruise, purple fading into black. He climbed onto his bike, the engine rumbling awake beneath him, and rode home alone under the darkening sky. The walk home from Riverbend High took Ellie 20 minutes on a good day. Today, with her crutches still the cheap aluminum kind from the medical supply store, it took closer to 30. Her right leg ached the way it always did by afternoon, a dull throb that ran from her hip down to her ankle, a souvenir from the accident 3 years ago that she carried everywhere she went. She kept her eyes down as she walked, the way she'd trained herself to do. Down meant invisible. Down meant nobody caught your eye and decided you were worth bothering with. It didn't always work, but today it did. She made it the whole way home without anyone saying a word to her, and that alone felt like a small victory. The house on Willow Street was small and a little tired-looking, with peeling white paint and a porch step that always stuck a little when you pushed on it. Ellie climbed it carefully, Crutches finding their familiar grooves, and pushed open the front door. "Ruth?" "I'm home," she called out, setting her backpack down by the door. "In the kitchen, honey," Ruth's voice floated back, tired but warm. Ellie made her way down the hall, the smell of something simmering on the stove reaching her before she even got to the doorway. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, a stack of papers spread out in front of her like a hand of cards nobody wanted to play. Bills, mostly. Ellie recognized the envelopes. The little red stamped words that said things like past due and final notice. Ruth was 71 years old, small and soft around the edges, with white hair pinned up in a bun that was always slightly coming undone by the afternoon. She'd raised 3 kids of her own decades ago, and now, in the years she thought she'd spend resting, she was raising a 4th. She never complained about it, not once, not out loud. But Ellie saw the tiredness in her aunt's eyes sometimes, saw the way her hands trembled a little more than they used to when she added up numbers that never seemed to add up right. "How was school?" Ruth asked, not looking up from the papers. "Fine," Ellie said, the word coming out automatic and empty. The way it always did. Ruth glanced up then, over the top of her glasses, studying Ellie's face for a moment the way she always did, like she was checking for cracks. "You hungry?" "I made stew." "Nothing fancy, just what we had." "Sounds good," Ellie said, and she meant it. Ruth's stew was one of the few things that still tasted like comfort to her. Ellie set her crutches against the wall and eased herself into the chair across from Ruth, watching her aunt shuffle the papers into a neater pile, sliding them into a folder like she could hide them away just by tucking the edges in. "You don't have to do that," Ellie said quietly. "I know they're bills." Ruth's mouth pressed into a tight line, and for a second she looked like she might argue, might insist it was nothing for Ellie to worry about. But then she just sighed, the fight going out of her shoulders. "It's handled," she said. "Don't you worry about it." Ellie didn't believe her. Not really, but she let it go. There wasn't much point pushing. Ruth would carry what she carried, quietly, the same way she always had, and Ellie had learned there was no arguing a woman like Ruth out of her worry. Dinner came a little while later, 2 bowls of stew and a plate of bread between them, the kitchen radio playing low in the background, some old country station Ruth liked. They ate in the kind of comfortable quiet that came from years of living together. The silence not empty, but full. Full of all the things they didn't need to say out loud. Ruth reached over at one point and patted Ellie's hand, her skin thin and papery, but warm. "I'm glad you're home," she said simply. "Me too," Ellie answered, and for a moment, sitting there in the warm kitchen with the smell of stew and the sound of the radio humming low, the weight of the day eased off her shoulders just a little. The Quick Stop sat on the corner of 5th and Main, its faded red awning flapping a little in the afternoon breeze. Ellie made her way across the parking lot slowly, her crutches tapping against the cracked asphalt in a steady rhythm she'd long since memorized. The sun hung low and orange, throwing long shadows across the parked cars, and the air still held on to the day's heat, even though September was creeping toward October. Ruth had asked for milk that morning, tucking a $5 bill into Ellie's hand before she left for school. "Just milk," Ruth had said. "Don't go spending it on anything else, you hear?" Ellie had smiled at that, because Ruth always said it like Ellie was the type to blow $5 on candy, when really she never bought anything for herself at all. The automatic doors of the Quick Stop slid open with a soft chime, and Ellie stepped inside, grateful for the blast of cool air conditioning. The store smelled like hot dogs turning on the rollers by the register and the faint sweetness of the slushy machine in the corner. She made her way down the narrow aisle toward the coolers in the back, her crutches squeaking slightly against the linoleum floor. She found the milk, a gallon of the store brand that was cheaper than the name brand, and tucked it against her side as best she could while keeping her balance. It wasn't easy, carrying something while walking on crutches, but she'd figured out a system over the years, a way of wedging things against her body so her hand stayed free enough to grip the handles. At the counter, the cashier, a heavy-set man named Gary who'd worked there as long as Ellie could remember, rang her up without much conversation. "Have a good one," he said, the words automatic, his eyes already drifting to the small television propped up behind the counter. "You too," Ellie answered, tucking her change into her pocket. The doors slid open again as she stepped back outside, the late afternoon sun hitting her face, warm and orange. She shifted the milk jug against her hip and started making her way across the parking lot toward the sidewalk, her mind already on the walk home, on dinner, on nothing in particular. That was when she heard the laughter. She recognized the voice before she even looked up. Braden Holt's laugh had a particular pitch to it, sharp and confident, the kind of laugh that expected an audience. He was leaning against the side of the building with 2 of his friends, Tyler and Josh. all three of them holding their phones loosely in their hands the way teenagers always seemed to. Ellie kept her head down, kept moving. Down meant invisible. Down meant maybe, if she was fast enough, this would be nothing. "Hey, look who it is," Braden said, pushing off the wall. Crutch girl. Ellie's stomach dropped, but she kept walking, faster now, her crutches clicking urgently against the pavement. "Where you going?" Braden called out, falling into step beside her, his friends trailing behind with their phones already lifting, already recording. "We're just saying hi." "Leave me alone," Ellie said quietly, not looking at him, just trying to get past. Get to the sidewalk. Get anywhere else. "What's the rush?" Tyler said, laughing. "You walk so slow anyway." "Yeah, watch this," Braden said. And before Ellie even understood what was happening, his hand shot out and shoved her shoulder, hard. She lost her balance instantly, the milk jug flying from her grip as she crashed down onto the pavement, her palms scraping against the rough asphalt, pain shooting up through her bad leg where it twisted beneath her. Her crutches clattered away from her, out of reach. "Oh my God, get that," Josh was saying, laughing, his phone pointed right at her. Braden stepped forward, and before Ellie could even process it, his foot came down on one of her crutches, once, twice, the aluminum bending and cracking under his sneaker. Tyler joined in, stomping the other one, both of them laughing, filming, feeding off each other's cruelty like it was a game. Ellie lay on the ground, her palms stinging, her leg throbbing, humiliation burning hot in her chest as she looked around at the parking lot. A woman near her car had stopped, frozen, watching. An older man by the ice machine stood still, his mouth slightly open. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Across the lot, Tonk had just clicked the gas pump into place when he heard the laughter change. He'd heard that kind of laughter before, a long time ago, coming from a group of kids outside his family's house, and something in his chest went cold, and still the way it always did when that sound reached his ears. He looked up and saw the girl on the ground, saw the boy's sneaker come down on the crutch, heard the crack of metal. Tank didn't run. He never ran. But his walk across that parking lot ate up ground fast, his boots hitting the pavement hard and even, his eyes locked on the boys like a man who had already decided something and wasn't going to be talked out of it. He was a big man, 6'4", built like something out of an old western, shoulders wide enough to block a doorway, arms thick with muscle and covered in faded ink that told stories nobody at that quick stop would ever know. His beard was gray at the edges, his leather vest worn soft from years of wear, patches sewn on with care. When he moved, people noticed. When he moved fast, people got out of the way. "Hey," Tank said, and his voice wasn't loud, but it carried, low and rough like gravel under a tire. Braden turned first, his smirk faltering the second he saw the size of the man walking toward them. Tyler's phone dropped an inch. Josh actually took a step back. "Get away from her," Tank said. Nobody argued. Nobody said a smart word back. Braden's mouth opened like he wanted to say something, some line to save face, but nothing came out. Tank kept walking, kept closing the distance, and that was enough. The boys scattered, phones still in their hands, sneakers slapping against the pavement as they bolted around the side of the building and out toward the street, laughter gone, replaced by the panicked energy of kids who suddenly understood they were in over their heads. Tank didn't chase them. He let them go. His attention was already on the girl on the ground. He knelt down next to her, slow and careful, the way a man kneels when he doesn't want to scare something small and hurting. "Hey now," he said, his voice gentle in a way that didn't match his size at all. "You're all right. I got you." Ellie stared up at him, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps, her palms burning, her leg aching where it had twisted under her. She didn't know this man. She didn't know why a giant covered in leather and tattoos was suddenly the gentlest thing in her whole world right then, but she let him slide an arm under her shoulders and help her sit up. "Easy," he said. "Take your time." He helped her to her feet, steady and patient, holding most of her weight without seeming to notice the effort. Once she was standing, wobbly but upright, he turned and walked over to where her crutches lay broken on the pavement. Twisted metal and cracked plastic, useless now. He picked them up anyway, turning them over in his big hands, and something passed behind his eyes, dark and quiet, the kind of anger that didn't need to be loud to be felt. By then, the woman who'd been frozen by her car had come rushing over, and Gary had come out from behind the counter, his face pale. "I saw it on the camera," Gary said. "I'm calling this in. Is she okay?" "Ellie, honey, are you okay?" "She needs to get home," Tank said, his voice calm now, steady. "Somebody who can drive her." "I can take her," Gary said quickly. "My shift's about done anyway. I'll get her home safe." Tank nodded, and together they got Ellie settled into the passenger seat of Gary's old sedan, the broken crutches laid carefully across her lap like something worth grieving over. Ellie looked back once, through the window, at the big man standing alone in the parking lot, and she didn't understand any of it. Not really. Not yet. Tank watched the car pull away until it turned onto Main Street and disappeared. Then he walked back to his truck, climbed in and sat there for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice before a voice answered. "I need the club," Tank said. "Tonight?" Ellie sat on the couch that evening with an ice pack pressed against her knee, her broken crutches leaning against the wall like two dead things nobody wanted to look at. Aunt Ruth had made tea, though neither of them had touched it. The television played some show neither of them was watching, just noise to fill the quiet. That was when they heard it. At first it was just a low hum, far off, like thunder rolling in from somewhere over the hills. Ruth glanced up from her chair, her brow creasing. "Storm coming?" she asked, though the sky outside had been clear all evening. The hum grew. It stopped being a hum and became a sound Ellie felt in her chest, a deep rolling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She set the ice pack down slowly, her heart starting to beat faster. "Ellie," Ruth said, standing now, moving toward the window with a hand pressed to her chest. "Ellie, come look at this." Ellie pulled herself up, wincing at the ache in her leg, and hobbled to the window on one good leg, holding the wall for balance. She pushed the curtain aside. Headlights, dozens of them, then more, rolling down their quiet street in a line that seemed to stretch back forever. Motorcycles, big ones, chrome catching the last orange light of sunset, engines rumbling low and steady like a heartbeat too big for one body. The riders wore leather vests, patches on their backs, and they came in formation, slow and deliberate, parking along the curb. In driveways, anywhere there was room. "Oh my word," Ruth whispered. More kept coming. What started as a dozen became 50, then closer to 100, then more still, until the whole street was lined with motorcycles and men and women standing beside them, arms crossed, faces calm. Neighbors were coming out onto their porches now, some in their pajamas, all of them staring at the impossible sight of 200 Hell's Angels filling their small, quiet street like some kind of army that had come from nowhere. Ellie's hands trembled against the windowsill. "Aunt Ruth," she said, her voice small, "why are they here?" Ruth didn't answer. She just kept watching, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open, like she was seeing a ghost she thought she'd buried a long time ago. A knock came at the door. Ruth jumped. Ellie froze. For a moment, neither of them moved, the sound of the engines outside finally dying down into a low idle. Then, silence, until all that was left was the knock, patient, waiting. Ruth crossed the room and opened the door. Tank stood on the porch, filling the doorway the way he'd filled that parking lot earlier, his leather vest catching the porch light, his gray beard neat, his eyes calm and steady. He'd changed out of his work clothes into something cleaner, though he still looked like a mountain that had wandered into their little neighborhood by mistake. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice low and polite. "Name's Marcus Delgado. Folks call me Tank." He glanced past Ruth toward Ellie, who was still holding on to the wall by the window. "I'm the one who was there today." At the quick stop. Ruth's hand went to her mouth, but she said nothing, just stared at him like she was trying to place a face out of an old photograph. "I won't take much of your time," Tank said. "I just wanted you to know, ma'am, that Ellie's going to be safe. Tonight and every night after. My club and I were going to make sure of it." "Safe from what?" Ruth finally managed. Are you threatening someone?" "No, ma'am," Tank said simply. "Nobody's getting threatened. We're just going to be here. That's all." Ellie limped closer, staring up at him from behind her aunt. "Why?" she asked, the only word she could manage. Tank looked at her for a long moment, something soft and sad passing behind his eyes. "That's a longer story," he said. "One I'll tell you when the time's right. Tonight, just know you can sleep easy." He nodded once to Ruth, then turned and walked back down the porch steps, back toward the small army of leather and chrome waiting in the street. Ellie stood at the window long after the door had closed, watching the bikers settle in for the night. Some leaning against their motorcycles, some standing in small clusters. All of them quiet. All of them still. She could not sleep. She simply watched, confused and overwhelmed, as the strangers kept their silent watch outside her home. Morning came gray and quiet. The bikers were still there, though fewer now, maybe 50 who had stayed through the night in shifts, the rest having rotated home sometime after midnight. Ellie had watched from her window until her eyes finally gave out around 3, and now she woke to sunlight and the smell of Ruth's coffee and the strange, heavy knowledge that her life had somehow changed overnight. She was still in her pajamas, sitting at the kitchen table with her leg propped on a chair when the knock came again. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. When she opened it, Tank stood there again, this time holding something long wrapped in an old moving blanket, cradled in his big arms like it was something precious. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Sorry to bother you so early. I made something for Ellie. Figured she shouldn't be without crutches, even for a day." Ruth stepped back to let him in, and he ducked his head slightly to fit through the doorway, careful, like a man used to being too big for most rooms. He set the blanket down on the couch and unwrapped it. Inside were a pair of crutches, clearly homemade but sturdy, the metal shafts padded with foam and wrapped tight with black tape, the handles carved smooth. "They're not fancy," Tank said. "Made them out of some old walker parts and pipe from the shop. But they'll hold you till we get you something better." Ellie hobbled over, staring at the crutches like they were something out of a dream. "You made these? Last night?" "Didn't sleep much anyway," Tank said, and something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Ruth had gone very still. She was staring at Tank now, really staring, her eyes narrowing, then widening, her hand slowly coming up to press against her chest the way it had the night before. "Marcus," she said slowly, like she was testing the name in her mouth. "Marcus Delgado." Tank turned to her, and something passed between them, some recognition that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "You know me?" he asked quietly. "I met you," Ruth said, "years ago, at Danny's wedding." Her voice had gone thin, shaky. "You were younger then, less gray in that beard, but I never forget a face." Ellie looked between them, confused. "Wait, you knew my dad?" The kitchen went silent except for the low tick of the clock on the wall. Tank looked at Ruth, and Ruth looked at him, and something unspoken passed between the two adults. Some old understanding. Some old grief. "Ruth," Tank said gently. "I think it's time she knew." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for Ellie's hand, pulling her down onto the couch beside her, the new crutches forgotten against the cushions. "Ellie." "Honey," Ruth said, her voice trembling. "Your father wasn't always the man you knew. Before you were born, before your mother, Danny rode with Marcus's club. He was a Hell's Angel." Ellie felt the words land like a physical blow. That can't be right. Dad hated motorcycles. He never even let me near one." "He left the club," Tank said quietly, sitting now in the armchair across from them, his big hands folded between his knees. "When your mother passed, and it was just him and you, he wanted a different life for you. Quieter, safer, in his mind. So he walked away. But he never stopped being one of us. Not in his heart. Why didn't he tell me?" Ellie's voice cracked. "He asked me to promise something," Tank said, his eyes steady on hers. "He asked me to watch over you, from a distance, and never say why. He didn't want that life touching yours. He wanted you to have a normal childhood. I kept that promise for 8 years, Ellie, long before he passed. I never wanted to reveal myself. But when I saw what happened yesterday, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Ellie sat frozen, staring at the crutches on the couch cushion, at Ruth's tear-streaked face, at Tank's steady, sorrowful eyes. Something inside her chest cracked open, grief and anger and confusion all tangled together. "He kept this from me," she whispered. "My whole life." Then, without another word, she pushed herself up, grabbed the new crutches, and limped toward her room, the door closing softly behind her as her tears finally broke free. Ellie woke to the sound of engines, low and steady, like a heartbeat that never stopped. For a second she forgot everything. Then it all came rushing back. The crutches, Ruth's face, Tank sitting there with his hands folded, telling her that her father had been someone else entirely, someone she never knew. She lay in bed a long moment, staring at the ceiling, before she made herself get up. Outside her window, the bikers were still there. Fewer than the night before, but still a solid line of them, leaning against their motorcycles, arms crossed, quiet. One of them, an older woman with silver hair and a red bandana, looked up at Ellie's window and gave a small nod, like she'd been expecting her. Ellie didn't wave back. She wasn't ready for that yet. She got dressed slowly, working the new crutches under her arms, testing her weight on them. They were heavier than her old ones, but sturdier too, the padded grips fitting her hands like they'd been made just for her, which she supposed they had. Ruth was quiet at breakfast. She kept glancing at Ellie like she wanted to say something else, some other piece of the story. But she didn't. Ellie didn't push. She didn't have room in her yet for more. The walk to school was strange. The bikers outside her house didn't follow her, but when she turned onto Maple Street, she saw them again, lined up along the fence outside Riverbend High, a dozen or so, leather vests catching the morning light. Kids clustered near the entrance, whispering, phones out, filming. Ellie kept her eyes down and kept walking. Inside, the whispers followed her down the hallway. She caught fragments as she passed. That's her. That's the girl. My cousin said there were like 200 of them last night. Did you see the video? Braden's probably gonna get killed. She said nothing. She kept her eyes on the floor and her crutches moving. 1, 2. 1, 2. The rhythm she'd learned a long time ago, the rhythm that let her disappear even when everyone was looking at her. Braden wasn't in first period. Or second. By lunch, someone said his mom had pulled him out for the day. Ellie felt a strange, hollow satisfaction at that, not quite happiness, but something close to it. She barely heard anything the teachers said all day. Her mind kept circling back to Tank's voice, low and even, saying he asked me to watch over you, from a distance, and never say why. 8 years. 8 years of some strange, silent guardian she never knew existed, keeping a promise to a man who was gone now and couldn't explain any of it himself. By the time the final bell rang, she couldn't stand it anymore. She didn't go home. She turned instead toward the edge of town, toward the low brick building with the faded sign that read Delgado's Custom Cycles, the crutches clicking against the sidewalk the whole way. The garage door was open. Tank was bent over a motorcycle engine, sleeves rolled up, grease on his forearms, and he looked up when her shadow crossed the doorway. "Ellie," he said, straightening. "Everything okay?" "No," she said. Her voice came out sharper than she meant it to, but she didn't take it back. "Nothing's okay. You knew my dad. You knew him better than I did, maybe, and I don't even know who he was." Tank set down his wrench slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, giving her time, the way he seemed to give everyone time. "I want to know everything," Ellie said, her chin lifting even as her eyes filled. "Not pieces. Not the parts you think I can handle. Everything. Who he was before me. Before my mom. All of it." Tank looked at her for a long moment, something soft and sad moving behind his eyes. "Okay," he said finally. "It's not a one-afternoon kind of story, Ellie. It's a lot of years. But I'll tell you everything, I promise you that." Starting with the people who knew him best, he nodded toward the back of the shop, where the sound of an old radio and someone laughing drifted out from the break room. "There's some folks I want you to meet," he said. "Doc, Rosie. They rode with your dad longer than I did. They'll want to tell you about him too." Tank led her through the back of the shop, past shelves stacked with oil filters and old tires, to a door that opened into a bigger space. Ellie hadn't expected this. The clubhouse wasn't what she'd imagined from movies, all shadows and cigarette smoke. It was bright, almost cozy, with a long wooden table, mismatched chairs, and a row of photographs pinned to a corkboard on the far wall. A woman was standing near the table, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a braid and a red bandana tied around her neck. Ellie recognized her. It was the woman who had nodded at her window that morning. "Well," the woman said, setting down the coffee pot and turning with a grin that took up her whole face. "Look who finally came to see us, Ellie," Tank said. "This is Rosie." Rosie crossed the room faster than Ellie expected, wrapping her in a hug before Ellie could brace for it. She smelled like leather and cinnamon gum, and her arms were surprisingly strong for someone her age. "I've been waiting 8 years to do that," Rosie said, pulling back but keeping her hands on Ellie's shoulders. "Your daddy used to show us pictures of you when you were just a baby. Little bald thing in a yellow dress. Cutest baby I ever saw. And I told him so." Ellie didn't know what to say to that. Her throat felt tight. A man came in from a side room, older, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and a limp of his own, though his came from a knee that had been replaced twice. Tank introduced him as Doc. "Danny Marsh's girl," Doc said, shaking his head slowly, like he still couldn't believe it. "You've got his eyes. Anybody ever tell you that?" "No," Ellie said quietly. "Nobody ever said that." "Well, you do." Doc pulled out a chair for her at the long table. "Sit. We got stories, if you want them." Ellie sat, setting her crutches against the table edge. Rosie poured her a mug of hot chocolate instead of coffee, sliding it over without asking, and settled into the chair across from her like she'd been waiting all day for this exact moment. "Your dad," Rosie started, "was the funniest man I ever knew. Not loud funny. Quiet funny. He'd wait the whole conversation, dead serious, and then say one thing that'd have the whole room falling apart laughing. Timing like nobody's business. He used to prank Tank something awful," Doc added, grinning, put a rubber snake in his toolbox. Tank about put his fist through the ceiling. Tank, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, allowed a small smile. "I still check that box before I reach in." Ellie found herself smiling too. Just a little, surprised at how it felt on her face, like a muscle she hadn't used in a long time. They kept going. Rosie talked about the charity rides she and Danny used to organize, raising money for the children's hospital 2 towns over. How Danny would dress up in a ridiculous inflatable dinosaur costume every single year because it made the kids in the ward laugh. Doc talked about the year Danny broke his arm trying to fix a transmission and still finished the job one-handed because he'd promised a single mother her car would be ready by Friday. And then Rosie's voice softened. She talked about Ellie's mother. How Danny used to light up like a kid himself whenever she walked into a room. How he'd talk about her for hours. How patient and kind she was. How he used to say marrying her was the only smart decision he ever made in his whole reckless life. "He loved you something fierce," Rosie said, reaching over to squeeze Ellie's hand. "Both of you. Never stopped, not for one day." Ellie sat there, listening, feeling something shift and settle inside her chest. Something that had been cracked open for 8 months finally starting, just barely, to knit itself back together. The afternoon light had turned gold by the time she realized how much time had passed. She gathered her crutches slowly, reluctant to leave. "Can I come back?" she asked, looking between Rosie and Doc and Tank. "I want to hear more, if that's okay." Rosie's whole face broke into a smile. "Honey," she said, "you never even have to ask." By Wednesday, the whole town seemed to have an opinion about the bikers parked outside the Marsh house. Ellie saw it first on her phone, scrolling through the Riverbend community page while Aunt Ruth made dinner. Someone named Debbie K. 1972 had posted a blurry photo of 3 motorcycles lined up outside the school. The caption in all capital letters, "Why is no one talking about this?" Gang activity in our school zone. The comments went on forever. Some people defended Tonk and the others, saying they'd heard what happened to Ellie, saying it was about time somebody stood up for that poor girl. But just as many were scared, or pretending to be scared, because it made for good talk at the diner. Mr. Petrov, who owned the hardware store on Main Street, told anyone who'd listen that he'd started locking his front door during business hours since the Hells Angels invasion, even though not one biker had ever stepped foot inside his shop. Linda Fessler, who ran the flower shop, wrote a whole letter to the town council demanding to know what the police department planned to do about this concerning situation before someone gets hurt. Ellie read the letter twice, her stomach twisting. Nobody had written a letter when Braden Holt smashed her crutches into pieces. Nobody had demanded anything then. "Don't let it get to you," Ruth said, setting a plate of spaghetti in front of her. "People talk. They talked when your father rode with that club too, years back. Talked plenty. Didn't stop him from being a good man. But what if they make the bikers leave?" Ellie asked. "What if the police make them go away?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She just reached over and patted Ellie's hand, the way she always did when she didn't have a good answer to give. The pressure kept building. By Thursday, someone had started a petition online asking the police department to take action against the motorcycle gang currently harassing Riverbend citizens. It had almost 300 signatures by Friday morning, even though nobody could point to a single thing the bikers had actually done except stand quietly on sidewalks with their arms crossed. Ruth decided enough was enough. She was still going to file that report about the Crutches, gang rumors or not. Ellie deserved that much, at least on paper, in the record, official, so on Saturday morning, they drove down to the Riverbend Police Department, a squat brick building with an American flag hanging limp outside. Tank followed behind on his motorcycle, though he told Ellie he'd wait outside. Said it might go smoother without him in the room. Ellie wasn't sure that made sense, but she didn't argue. Inside, the station smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. A young officer sat behind the front desk, thumbing through paperwork, barely looking up when Ruth explained why they'd come. "We'd like to file a report," Ruth said, her voice steady but polite. "My niece was assaulted outside the Quick Stop last week. Her crutches were destroyed. We have witnesses. We may even have video." The officer, whose name tag read J. Dunlap, finally looked up. He glanced at Ellie, at her leg brace, at the crutches leaning against the counter, and something in his face closed off like a door shutting. "You said Quick Stop?" he asked, tapping a pen against the desk. "That's what, over a week ago now?" 8 days, Ellie said quietly. Dunlop pulled a form toward him, slow like it cost him something. "You get the names of these kids?" "One of them," Ruth said. Braden Holt. There might have been video taken by a classmate too, were still, Dunlop's pen stopped moving. "Braden Holt," he repeated, flat, yes. He set the pen down entirely. "Look, ma'am, kids do dumb stuff. Filing something like this, dragging a name through the mud based on second-hand accounts, that's a serious step. You sure you want to go that route? She was on the ground, Ruth said, her voice sharpening. They stomped her crutches to pieces. That's not kids being dumb. That's assault. Dunlap sighed, the kind of sigh that made it clear he'd already decided how this would end. I'll note it in the system. Someone will follow up if there's anything solid. He didn't write anything down. Outside, Tank stood by his bike, arms crossed, watching the door. When Ellie and Ruth came out, her face tight, Ruth's jaw clenched with frustration, he didn't need them to say a word. Something about the way that officers' eyes had shifted when Braden's name came up settled into Tank's gut like a stone. And he found himself wondering, for the first time, exactly how deep this thing went. The cafeteria at Riverbend High was loud in that way school cafeterias always are. Trays clattering. Voices bouncing off the linoleum. Someone's music playing too loud from a speaker at the far table. Ellie sat alone at the end of a long table near the window, picking at a sandwich she didn't really want. The crutches Tank had loaned her leaned against the wall beside her. They were plain and metal and temporary, but he'd wrapped the handles with soft cloth so they wouldn't dig into her palms. She thought about that kindness more than she wanted to admit. People walked past her table like she wasn't there. That part wasn't new. She'd been invisible for 3 years now, since the accident, since the limp, since the quiet way her world had shrunk down to hallways and homework and the careful art of not being seen. "Hey, Ellie." She looked up. A boy stood at the end of the table, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He wore a faded hoodie with a tear in the sleeve and kept his eyes down, like he was afraid of what he might see if he actually looked at her. Miguel Torres. He was in her English class. She didn't know him well. He was the kind of quiet that blended into the walls, the kind of quiet she understood. "Hi," she said, cautious. He glanced around the cafeteria, checking for anyone watching, and Ellie's chest tightened. She knew that look. That was the look of someone who had something dangerous to say and was trying to decide if he could survive saying it. "Can I sit?" he asked. She nodded and he slid into the chair across from her, keeping his hands in his lap. His fingers were white-knuckled around the edge of the table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I saw what happened," he finally said, "outside the quick stop. I was there." The memory slammed into her, the pavement scraping against her palms. Braden's laugh. The sound of her crutches snapping, sharp and final, like bones. She'd tried to put it away, to push it down into a place she didn't have to visit, but it lived close to the surface. It was always close. "You watched?" she said, and the words came out smaller than she meant them to. Miguel winced. "No, I mean, yes, I saw it. I saw everything." His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked down at the table like he was searching for something in the scuffed plastic. "I had my phone out. I was recording." Ellie's breath caught. "I didn't know what to do," he said quickly, the words tumbling out now, like he'd been holding them in too long and they were pushing to get out all at once. "Braden, everyone's scared of him. You know how it is, he controls everything. And his dad is the police chief. Who's going to believe me? Who's going to do anything?" He swallowed hard. "I was scared, Ellie. I'm still scared. But I've been watching all week. The bikers outside your house. Your school. I saw them just standing there. Standing up for you. And I kept thinking, I couldn't even record and tell someone. You didn't do anything wrong, Ellie said quietly, and she meant it. I didn't do anything at all, Miguel said. That's worse. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a phone. An older model, cracked in one corner, held together with a thick rubber case. He set it on the table between them like it was something fragile, like it might shatter. It's all on there, he said. From the beginning. The whole thing. What they said to you. The part where he knocked you down. The crutches. Everything. Ellie stared at the phone. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her hands trembled a little as she reached for it. Why are you giving me this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miguel finally looked up, meeting her eyes. There was fear there, yes, but there was something else too. Something steady underneath. Because somebody should have stood up for you that day, he said. And I didn't. But I can do this now. Ellie took the phone. It was warm from being held against him, and heavier than she expected. She pressed the home button, and the screen lit up. There it was. A thumbnail image of herself on the ground, grainy and distant but real. She had to look away. I'll keep it safe, she said. Promise me, Miguel said. He can't know it came from me. If Braden finds out, I'm dead, and my family too. He won't, Ellie said, and she believed it. I promise. Miguel nodded slowly, then stood, pulling his backpack straps tight over his shoulders. He paused for a moment, like he wanted to say something else, but then he just gave her a small nod and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of students. Ellie sat there holding the phone, her mind spinning. She looked at it again. The footage was right there. The proof. The truth. She pulled out her own phone and dialed Tank's number. He answered on the second ring. Ellie, you okay? I need to see you, she said, her voice shaking. I have something. The video. Someone recorded the whole thing. There was a pause. She could hear the hum of engines in the background, the low clang of someone working on metal. Where are you? Tank's voice was calm, steady, at school. I'm about to get picked up. Keep it safe, he said. Don't show it to anyone. Don't tell anyone you have it. Just bring it to the shop tomorrow. We'll figure out the right way to use it. The legal way. You're not going to just go after them? Another pause. When Tank spoke again, his voice was soft. Your father taught me that real strength isn't about who you can hurt. It's about doing the right thing even when it's slow, even when it's hard. We do this the right way, Ellie. I promise you that. Ellie closed her eyes. For the first time in hours, her shoulders relaxed just a little. Okay, she said. Tomorrow, she hung up and looked down at Miguel's phone, turning it over in her hands. She held it close to her chest like it was a lifeline. And maybe, she thought, it was. Delgado's custom cycles smelled like it always did. Motor oil, hot metal, and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. Ellie stepped through the open garage door on her borrowed crutches, the cloth-wrapped handles familiar under her palms now, like they belonged to her. Tank was waiting at the workbench, a laptop already open in front of him. He'd cleared away the tools and wiped the surface clean. Doc sat on a stool nearby, arms crossed, watching the door like he was expecting trouble. You bring it? Tank asked. Ellie held up Miguel's phone. Good girl, Tank said. Let's see it. He plugged the phone into the laptop with careful hands. Hands that looked too big and rough for something so small and delicate, but they moved with a gentleness that surprised her every time. The video loaded. Tank hit play. Ellie made herself watch. It was harder than she thought it would be, seeing herself from the outside, seeing the way Braden's mouth curled up right before he shoved her, the way her crutches splintered under his boot like they were nothing. She heard the boys laughing. She heard herself hit the pavement. Doc's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything, but his hand curled into a fist on his knee. Tank paused the video. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low and even, the kind of calm that came from working hard to keep it that way. "That's enough to press charges," he said. "That's assault. Clear as day." "So why didn't the police do anything before?" Ellie asked. "I told them what happened. I gave a statement. They said they'd look into it. Nobody ever called me back." Doc shifted on his stool. "I made some calls this morning," he said. "Old buddy of mine still works dispatch over at the station. Owes me a favor from way back." Tank looked at him. "And?" "Braden Holt," Doc said. "That's Chief Holt's kid, the chief's own son." The words landed in the garage like a wrench dropped on concrete. Ellie felt her stomach drop. "The police chief's son did this to me?" "Looks that way," Doc said. "That can't be a coincidence," Tank said slowly. "Not the way they brushed you off. Not the way nobody followed up." Doc leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "My buddy said there's been other complaints too. Over the last year. Nothing formal, nothing that stuck. Parents come in wanting to file something about Braden picking on some kid, and it just sort of disappears, gets marked as resolved. No paperwork trail worth mentioning." Tank's eyes darkened. Ellie had never seen him look quite like that before. Not angry exactly, but something colder and more focused, like a man doing math in his head and not liking the answer. "He's been burying it," Tank said. "Chief Holt has been burying complaints about his own son. Probably has been for months." "Why would he do that?" Ellie asked, though part of her already knew. "Election's coming up," Doc said. "Man's been chief for 12 years. Last thing he needs is his own kid's name showing up in a police report right before people go vote." Ellie felt sick. All those months of feeling invisible, of nobody caring, of nobody helping. It wasn't because nobody noticed. It was because somebody in charge had decided her pain wasn't worth the trouble. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We can't just walk into the police station and hand them the video. They'll bury it too." Tank closed the laptop gently, like he was closing a door on something. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Your dad used to say something," he said finally. He said the loudest voice in the room isn't always the strongest one. Sometimes strength is just telling the truth clearly enough that people can't look away from it. He looked at Ellie, and there was something steady and sure in his eyes. "We're not going to go around the law," he said. "We're going to make sure the truth gets seen by enough people that it can't get buried again. There's a reporter in town. Carla Jimenez. She's fair. She's careful. She doesn't print things unless she's sure. If we bring her the video, the statements, everything Doc found, she'll know what to do with it." Doc nodded slowly. "She's tough, but she's honest. If anyone can get this out without it turning into a circus, it's her." "Tomorrow morning," Tank said. "We'll go see her together. All of it, out in the open, done right." The Riverbend Diner sat on Main Street with a flickering neon sign that spelled out "Eat" in pink letters. One bulb dead so it just said E.T. Ellie had passed it 100 times but never gone inside. The bell over the door jingled as Tank held it open for her, waiting patient as always while she got her crutches settled on the step. Carla Jimenez was already at a corner booth, a laptop bag at her feet and a mug of coffee in front of her that looked like it had been refilled twice. She was maybe 50, with sharp eyes behind wire glasses and gray streaking through dark hair pulled back tight. She stood when she saw them coming, and Ellie noticed she didn't flinch at Tank's size the way most people did. She just studied him, careful and unafraid, like she was reading a page. "Mr. Delgado," she said, shaking his hand. "And you must be Ellie." "Thanks for meeting us," Tank said, sliding into the booth across from her. Ellie sat beside him, setting her crutches against the wall. "I don't usually take meetings with bikers," Carla said, a small smile at the corner of her mouth. "But Doc Rivera called in a favor, and Doc doesn't call in favors for nothing." "This isn't nothing," Tank said. He nodded to Ellie, and she pulled Miguel's phone from her jacket pocket, hands trembling just slightly as she set it on the table between them. She'd watched the video 3 times now. It didn't get easier. "Go ahead," Tank said gently. "Show her." Ellie pressed play. She watched Carla's face instead of the screen this time, watched the reporter's expression go still and hard as she saw Braden's smirk, heard the crack of the crutches under his boot, heard the laughter of the boys who filmed it like it was something funny, something to share. When it ended, Carla sat back against the booth, quiet for a moment. "That's Chief Holt's son," she said. It wasn't a question. "You knew?" Ellie asked. "I've heard rumors," Carla said. "Nothing I could ever pin down. Parents don't like going on record against the chief of police. Not in a town this small." She looked at Tank. "You're telling me this isn't the first time?" "Doc found out this morning," Tank said. "Complaints going back at least a year. Kids getting picked on, parents coming forward, and then nothing. No paperwork. No follow-up. It just disappears." "My Aunt Ruth said the same thing," Ellie added quietly. "Not about Braden exactly, but she said the police station's been like that for years. If you don't have the right name or the right connections, nobody listens." Carla pulled out a small notebook from her bag, flipping it open, though Ellie noticed she hadn't started writing yet. She was still watching them, still deciding something. "Here's my concern," Carla said. "I run this story tomorrow, cold, on my own, and Chief Holt's people paint it as a journalist with a grudge, or worse, as some biker gang stirring up trouble to make themselves look like heroes. People already don't know what to make of you all showing up the way you did. It'll get dismissed before it ever gets read." "So, what do you suggest?" Tank asked. Carla tapped her pen against the notebook. "There's a town council meeting next week. Public forum, open floor, cameras from the regional station usually show up for it because Holt likes to grandstand about his crime numbers." She looked at Ellie now, steady and direct. "If you're willing, you tell your story there. In public. In front of everyone. I'll have already done my digging by then, quietly, so when you speak, I can back it up with facts, not just video." Ellie felt her stomach tighten. "In front of the whole town?" "I know that's a big ask," Carla said, her voice softening just slightly. "But a story told once in a newspaper gets read and forgotten. A girl standing up in front of her whole town, telling the truth about what happened to her, with proof nobody can argue with sitting right behind her. That's not something people forget. That's something that changes things." Tank looked at Ellie, waiting, not pushing. "It's your call," he said. "Whatever you decide, we're behind you." Ellie looked down at the phone on the table at the frozen image of herself lying on the pavement. Then she looked up at Carla. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it." Rosie showed up at Ruth's house the next afternoon with a stack of index cards and a look on her face like she meant business. "You're not memorizing a speech," she said, dropping the cards on the kitchen table. "You're telling the truth. Nobody needs notes to tell the truth." "I don't know if I can just stand there and talk," Ellie said, "in front of everybody." Rosie pulled out a chair, spun it around, and sat on it backward, her arms crossed over the top of it. She had a way of looking at people that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, and right now she aimed that look straight at Ellie. "You know what I do before every charity ride. When I gotta stand up and talk to 100 bikers about where the money's going?" Rosie asked. "I get sick to my stomach. Every single time, 15 years, and it never stops." "Really?" "Every time," Rosie said. "But here's the thing, nobody in that crowd knows my stomach hurts. All they see is a woman who cares about what she's saying. That's all you gotta do, kid, care about it. The rest takes care of itself." They practiced in the kitchen, then out on Ruth's porch, then in the backyard where Ellie could pace without worrying about tripping over the crutches. Rosie played every rude question, every sneer, every skeptical face Ellie might see in that council room, and slowly, over the days that followed, Ellie's voice stopped shaking quite so much. She stopped looking down at her feet. She found the parts of her story that mattered most and let the rest fall away. Meanwhile, Tank was on the phone constantly. Ellie heard him talking to chapter presidents from 3 counties over, his voice calm and steady, laying out exactly how he wanted things to go. "No colors that say anything provoking," he told Doc one evening at the shop. "No revving engines outside the building. We roll in quiet, we park neat, and we stand there like we got nothing to hide. Because we don't. You think 200 bikers standing quiet is gonna look peaceful to people?" Doc asked, wiping grease off a wrench. "It's gonna look like exactly what it is," Tank said. "People standing behind a girl who deserves to be heard. That's it. That's the whole message." The night before the meeting, Ruth dropped Ellie off at the clubhouse, a low brick building on the edge of town with a gravel lot and string lights hung along the porch. Tank was waiting for her on the steps, a mug of coffee in each hand, though Ellie suspected hers was mostly milk and sugar, the way he always made it for her. They sat together on the porch steps, the evening cooling around them, crickets starting up somewhere in the grass. "You ready?" Tank asked. "I think so," Ellie said. "Rosie says being scared doesn't mean I'm not ready. It just means it matters." Tank smiled at that, the kind of smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Rosie's smart. They sat quiet for a moment. And then Tank spoke again, his voice lower, like he was pulling the memory up from somewhere deep. "Your dad testified once," Tank said, "years back, before you were born. There was a kid in the shop, worked for me part-time, and his stepfather used to come around drunk, causing trouble. One night it got bad. Real bad. Cops didn't want to get involved, said it was a family matter." He shook his head slowly. "Your dad saw the whole thing happen, and when it went to court, everybody told him to stay quiet. Told him a guy who rides with a club like ours testifying would just make things worse, make the judge see him as trouble instead of a witness." "What did he do?" Ellie asked. "He stood up anyway," Tank said. "Walked into that courtroom in his cut, sat right there in front of everybody, and told the truth. Didn't dress it up, didn't make excuses for himself, just told them what he saw. Tank looked at her. Judge believed him. Kid got taken somewhere safe. Your dad never talked about it again. Wasn't looking for credit. He just did what was right because it was right. Ellie felt something settle in her chest, warm and steady. He wasn't scared? Oh, he was scared, Tank said. Told me so himself, after, but he said scared didn't matter much once you knew what you had to do. Ellie looked out at the string lights swaying gently in the breeze, thinking about her father sitting in a courtroom, steady and unafraid despite the fear underneath. Later that night, tucked into the guest room at the clubhouse, Ellie lay in the dark and thought about tomorrow. Her stomach still fluttered, but underneath the nerves was something new, something solid. She was ready. The Riverbend Town Hall had never seen a crowd like this. Folding chairs filled every inch of the meeting room, and when those ran out, people stood along the walls, packed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters sat near the front with notepads and cameras, and outside, lining the sidewalk and spilling into the parking lot, stood 200 Hells Angels in their leather cuts, quiet as church on a Sunday morning. They didn't rev their engines. They didn't shout. They just stood there, arms crossed, faces calm. A wall of quiet support that stretched from the doors of the town hall all the way to the street. Inside, Ellie sat in the front row between Ruth and Tank. Her new crutches leaned against her chair, her hands twisted together in her lap. The council members sat up front behind a long table, and at the far end sat Chief Holt, his uniform pressed sharp, his face unreadable. When her name was called, Ellie's heart slammed against her ribs. Tank reached over and squeezed her shoulder, just once, steady as a rock. "Go on," he said quietly. "We're right here." She stood, gripped her crutches, and made her way to the podium. The room was so quiet she could hear her own crutches tapping against the floor. She looked out at all those faces, some curious, some doubtful, some kind. She found Ruth's face, then Tank's, then Rosie's near the back, giving her a small nod. Ellie took a breath. "My name is Ellie Marsh," she said, and her voice only shook a little. 3 years ago, I was in a car accident. My mom died. I lost the use of my leg. I use crutches to walk. She paused, steadying herself. A few weeks ago, 3 boys knocked me down outside the quick stop. They broke my crutches. They filmed it and laughed while I was lying on the ground. Her voice caught, but she kept going. Nobody helped me. Nobody said anything. Except one man who happened to be filling his gas tank across the lot. She glanced at Tank, and something in his eyes made her stand a little taller. I found out later that this wasn't the first time Braden Holt targeted kids like me. It just wasn't ever filmed before. It wasn't ever seen. Her eyes moved to Chief Holt, and when we tried to report what happened, nothing happened. No charges, no follow-up, just silence. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Chief Holt's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I'm not standing here because I want revenge," Ellie said. "I'm standing here because I want the truth. That's all. Just the truth." She stepped back from the podium, her legs shaking, and the room erupted into applause that seemed to catch even her by surprise. That was when Carla Jimenez stood up from the reporters section, a laptop tucked under her arm. "If the council will allow it," Carla said, "I have evidence relevant to tonight's discussion." The council chairwoman nodded, and Carla connected her laptop to the projector at the front of the room. The video began to play, grainy but unmistakable, Miguel's shaky footage showing Braden and his friends surrounding Ellie, knocking her down, stomping her crutches into pieces while they laughed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone near the back said, "Oh my God," loud enough for everyone to hear. This footage was submitted to the Riverbend Police Department 3 weeks ago, Carla continued, her voice calm and clear. Along with 2 other formal complaints against Braden Holt dating back over a year. All 3 were closed without investigation. All 3 were signed off by Chief Holt himself. The room went dead silent, then exploded into noise, voices rising over each other, shock and anger crackling through the crowd like electricity. "Is that true?" one council member demanded, turning to the chief. "Chief Holt, is this true?" Chief Holt stood slowly, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it again, then finally said, "I was trying to protect my son." "By covering up a crime?" Someone shouted from the crowd. The chief's shoulders sagged. He looked older suddenly, smaller, the weight of the room pressing down on him. "I am announcing my resignation, effective immediately," he said quietly. "And I will be recommending my son be referred to the juvenile justice system, as he should have been from the start." The room erupted again. This time, with something that sounded almost like relief. The clubhouse buzzed with light and noise long before Ellie and Ruth pulled into the gravel lot. Strings of bulb lights crisscrossed overhead, and the smell of grilled food drifted out into the evening air. Hot dogs and burgers and something with peppers that made Ellie's stomach growl before she even got out of the truck. "You ready?" Ruth asked, patting Ellie's knee. Ellie looked at the building, at the bikes lined up in neat rows outside, chrome catching the last orange light of the sunset. A few weeks ago, the sight of all that leather and metal would have scared her. Now it felt like coming home. "Yeah," she said. "I'm ready." Inside, the clubhouse was packed. Long tables sagged under bowls of potato salad and trays of cornbread. Someone had strung up a banner across the far wall that read "Welcome Home Ellie" in letters that looked hand-painted, a little crooked, a little perfect. Music played from a speaker in the corner, something with a steady guitar and a voice that sounded like gravel and honey. Rosie spotted her first and let out a whoop that could have been heard 3 towns over. "There she is." She hollered, and suddenly Ellie was surrounded, hugged by people whose names she barely knew a month ago. People with tattoos up their necks and scars on their knuckles who smiled at her like she was the most important person in the world. Doc pressed a plate into her hands before she could even find a seat. "Eat," he said. "You're too skinny. Tank's orders." "Since when does Tank give orders about my weight?" Ellie laughed. "Since always," Doc said, and winked. She found Tank near the grill, sleeves rolled up, tongs in hand, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. He caught her eye and nodded toward an empty seat at the table closest to him, like he'd been saving it. The night rolled on easy and warm. Someone brought out a guitar and played old songs that had everyone singing along, off-key and happy. Kids from the club families ran between the tables, chasing each other with sparklers someone had lit despite it not being any holiday at all. Ellie laughed more that night than she had in months, maybe years. She caught herself forgetting, for whole stretches of time, that she'd ever been afraid of anything. Around 9, Tank stood up at the head of the room and clinked a fork against his glass. The chatter died down slow, then all at once. "I'm not a man of many words," Tank said, and a few people chuckled because everyone knew that was true. "But I got something to say tonight, and something to show. He nodded to Rosie, who disappeared into a back room and came out carrying something wrapped in a blanket, long and careful like she was carrying something precious. She set it down gently in front of Ellie. "Go on," Tank said. "Open it." Ellie's hands trembled as she pulled back the blanket. Underneath were a pair of crutches, but not like any she'd ever had. These were built strong and sleek, dark metal with careful engraving along the sides. She traced her fingers over the letters and her breath caught in her throat. Danny Marsh, it read, along with the chapter's insignia, a winged wheel, etched deep into the metal. "Your dad was one of us," Tank said, his voice thick. "Long before you were born. We wanted you to carry a piece of him with you, every step." Ellie couldn't speak. Tears blurred her vision as she held the crutches close, running her thumb over her father's name again and again like she could feel him through the letters. "There's more," Tank said. "We started a fund, the Danny Marsh Memorial Scholarship. For kids like you, Ellie. Kids who need a little extra help getting where they're going. We already got the first donations coming in." The room broke into applause, but Ellie barely heard it. She sat there holding the crutches that bore her father's name, surrounded by people who had become, somehow, without her even noticing, her family. For the first time since she'd buried her father, she felt something settle deep in her chest. She belonged here. The following Tuesday started like any other day at Delgado's Custom Cycles. The bay doors were rolled up to let in the warm afternoon air, and the radio on the workbench played some old rock song that Doc kept humming along to off-key. Tank was bent over a motorcycle engine, grease on his hands, a rag tucked into his back pocket, when his cell phone buzzed on the counter. He wiped his hands and picked it up. Doc noticed him go still as he read the screen. "Bank?" Tank muttered, and answered it. At first, it was just business. Ellie could hear it later, when Doc told her about it, how it started calm enough. But then, Tank's voice changed. He walked a few steps away, back straight, shoulders tight. "That's not what we agreed on," Tank said into the phone, his voice low and hard. "I've been paying that account on time for 8 months. You're telling me now there's a problem?" Doc glanced up from the bike he was working on, brow furrowed. He couldn't hear the other end of the call, but he didn't need to. Something was wrong. Tank's face had gone pale under his tan, and a thin sheen of sweat had broken out across his forehead, though the shop wasn't especially hot that day. "Look," Tank said, his voice rising slightly. "I need you to fix this. Today, I've got a kid counting on that account, and I am not going to let some paperwork mistake mess with her future." He pressed a hand to his chest. Doc set down his wrench. "Tank?" Tank didn't answer. He took a step, swayed, and the phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the concrete floor. His face twisted, not in anger anymore, but in pain, a deep, gripping pain that folded him forward at the waist. Tank. Doc was across the shop in 3 strides, catching him just as his knees buckled. The big man's weight nearly took them both down, but Doc managed to ease him onto the floor, cradling his head so it wouldn't crack against the concrete. Hey. Stay with me," Doc said, his voice sharp now, all business, the old medic training kicking in hard and fast. He pressed 2 fingers to Tank's neck, found the pulse. Too fast, too weak. Tank's lips had gone a strange shade, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Chest pain?" Doc asked, though he already knew the answer from the way Tank's hand was still clutched over his heart. "Tank, look at me. Stay with me." Tank's eyes fluttered, tried to focus on Doc's face, and he managed one word. "Ellie, she's fine, she's fine. You worry about you right now," Doc said, already pulling his phone from his pocket with his free hand. His fingers, usually so steady, shook as he dialed. "This is Rivera at Delgado's Custom Cycles on Route 9. I need an ambulance, possible cardiac event, male 45 years old, conscious but unstable." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, calm and practiced, asking questions Doc answered without looking away from Tank's face. "Stay with me," he kept saying, half to Tank and half to himself. "Stay with me, big man." Not today. Not like this. The ambulance took 11 minutes, though it felt to Doc like 11 years. By the time the paramedics burst through the bay doors, Tank's eyes had closed, his breathing shallow and uneven, and Doc had to step back to let them work, his hands still trembling from the effort of holding his oldest friend together. Only after they'd loaded Tank onto the stretcher, oxygen mask over his face, did Doc remember to call Ellie. His hands shook so badly, he nearly dropped the phone twice before her voice answered. "Doc? What's wrong?" "It's Tank," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "You need to get to Riverbend General." Now Ellie, she didn't remember much of the drive, only Ruth's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel and the way the town blurred past the windows, gray and formless. When they burst through the emergency room doors, a nurse was already calling out orders, and Ellie caught one glimpse of Tank's still form being wheeled through a set of double doors marked emergency, before those doors swung shut and swallowed him whole. She stood frozen in the hallway, her father's engraved crutches gripped so tight in her hands that her knuckles went white, and the fear that had haunted her for 8 months rose up all over again, cold and familiar and impossible to breathe past. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. Ellie sat in a plastic chair that was too hard, her father's crutches leaning against her knee, and stared at the double doors that had swallowed Tank up almost an hour ago. Nobody had come to tell them anything yet. Ruth sat beside her, her purse in her lap, her fingers picking at the strap. She looked older than Ellie had ever seen her, the lines around her eyes deep and tired. "Ellie, honey," Ruth said, her voice thin. Doc mentioned Tank keeps a folder in his saddlebag, insurance cards, next of kin, that sort of thing. The nurses are going to need it. Would you check? His bike's still in the lot. They let Doc bring it around. Ellie nodded, glad for something to do with her hands, something that wasn't just sitting and waiting and being afraid. She grabbed her crutches and made her way outside, the afternoon sun feeling wrong somehow. Too bright and too normal for a day like this. Tank's motorcycle sat parked near the entrance, the black paint gleaming, the leather saddlebag worn soft with age. Her hands trembled as she undid the buckle. Inside was a battered folder, the edges soft and curled from being carried around for who knew how long. She pulled it out and opened it right there in the parking lot, meaning only to check for the insurance card. But papers spilled out, more than she expected. Bank statements. Receipts, a stack of them, held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. She almost put them back. It felt wrong, like snooping. But her eyes had already caught her own name, printed in neat block letters on one of the statements. Marsh. E. Her stomach dropped. She sat down right there on the curb, ignoring the ache in her hip, and went through the papers one by one, her hands shaking harder with each page. Payments to Riverbend General, dated 8 months back, right after her father died. A payment to the school district, marked tuition assistance. E. Marsh. Physical therapy bills, the ones Ruth always said were handled, taken care of. Don't you worry about it, honey. All of them stamped paid, all of them traced back to an account under the name Delgado. There were dozens. Maybe more. Going back months and months, quiet and steady, like a heartbeat nobody noticed until it stopped. Ellie's throat closed up. She thought of Ruth's tired shoulders, the way her aunt always said money was tight but never seemed to panic about the bills, the way things had just worked out, again and again, since her father died. She had thought it was luck. She had thought Ruth had some savings tucked away. She had never once thought it was Tank. Quietly, silently, paying for her life while never asking for a single thing in return. She thought about him lying somewhere behind those doors right now, his heart failing. Maybe because of stress, because of money problems, because he'd been carrying her on his back this whole time and she never even knew it. The folder slipped from her hands. Papers scattered across the pavement, and she didn't even try to catch them. She just sat there on the curb and cried, big ugly sobs that shook her whole body, the kind she hadn't let herself do since the day they buried her father. She didn't hear Ruth come out until her aunt's hand was on her back, gentle and warm. Oh, honey. Ruth knelt down slowly, her knees creaking, and gathered up the scattered papers without looking at them, like she already knew. You knew, Ellie choked out. Didn't you? You knew he was doing this. Ruth was quiet for a moment, smoothing the papers into a neat stack against her knee. I suspected, she said finally. I never asked. Some things you don't ask about. You just say thank you and let a person be kind. Her voice wavered. I didn't know it was this much, Ellie. I swear to you, I didn't know it was this much. Ellie pressed her face into her aunt's shoulder, the crutches clattering to the ground beside them, forgotten. Why would he do that? Why would he give us everything and never say a word? Ruth wrapped her arms around her, holding tight, rocking her gently the way she used to when Ellie was small. Because he loved your father, she whispered into her hair. And because, somewhere along the way, I think he started loving you too. By the time Ellie and Ruth gathered themselves and went back inside, the waiting room had already begun to change. Doc was the first one there. He came through the sliding doors still wearing his shop apron, grease on his hands like he hadn't even stopped to wash up. His face was tight, worried in a way Ellie had never seen on him before. He always joked around the shop, always had some dry comment ready. Not tonight. Tonight he just walked straight to Ruth and Ellie and asked, "What have they told you?" "Nothing yet," Ruth said. "They took him back for tests. Something about his heart." Doc nodded slowly, like he'd been afraid of that answer. He sat down 2 chairs away, close enough to be near them, far enough to give them room, and he didn't say much else. He just waited, the way people do when words don't help. Word moved fast after that. Ellie didn't know how, but somehow the whole club seemed to hear within the hour. By nightfall, the waiting room that had felt so empty and quiet with just her and Ruth was full of leather vests and worn boots and the low rumble of men and women talking in hushed voices. Rosie came in like a small storm, her eyes red already, and she went straight to Ellie and pulled her into a hug so tight it nearly lifted her off her feet. "He's tough." Rosie said into her hair. "Tank's the toughest man I know. He's not going anywhere." More bikers filed in behind her, taking up the plastic chairs, leaning against the walls, standing in clusters by the vending machines. Some of them Ellie recognized from the celebration at the clubhouse. Others she'd never met, older men with gray beards and quiet eyes. Younger ones who looked nervous and kept checking their phones for updates that hadn't come yet. Nobody was loud. Nobody made a scene. They just filled the room with their presence, patient and solid, like they were building a wall between Tank and whatever was trying to take him. Ellie noticed Miguel's mother arrive with him not long after, both of them still in their coats like they'd left the house in a hurry. Miguel gave Ellie a small, awkward wave, and his mother squeezed Ellie's shoulder as she passed, murmuring, "We heard." "We wanted to be here." Carla the journalist showed up too, without a notebook, without a camera, just a paper cup of coffee in each hand. She handed one to Ruth without a word, and sat down nearby, her presence quiet and steady. By 10 o'clock, the waiting room had become something Ellie never could have imagined a few months ago. Leather-clad bikers sat shoulder to shoulder with teachers, shop owners, and neighbors who used to whisper about the club with suspicion in their eyes. Now they all sat together, united by one man who had touched each of their lives in ways most of them were only now piecing together out loud, in murmured stories passed between chairs. Someone said Tank had fixed their car for free after a layoff. Someone else said he'd quietly paid for a funeral. A woman near the door said he'd once spent a whole weekend teaching her son how to ride a bike after her husband left. Ellie sat in the middle of it all, holding the folder Ruth had helped her gather from the parking lot, hugging it against her chest like it was something precious now, instead of something that had broken her heart open a few hours ago. The clock ticked past midnight. Then, 1. The room grew quieter, heads nodding, some people dozing in their chairs. But nobody left. Nobody even suggested it. Finally, near 2 in the morning, the double doors swung open and a doctor stepped through, her scrubs wrinkled, a clipboard in her hand. The whole room seemed to hold its breath at once. "Family of Marcus Delgado?" she asked, looking around at the crowd with something like surprise. Nearly every person in the room stood up. The doctor allowed herself a small, tired smile. "He's stable," she said. "We were able to clear the blockage. He's going to need rest, and we'll be monitoring him closely for the next few days, but he came through it." The room broke into a wave of quiet sobs and relieved laughter, hands clasping other hands, heads bowing in gratitude. Ruth gripped Ellie's arm so hard it almost hurt. Ellie stepped forward before she could stop herself. "When he wakes up," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "I want to be the first one he sees." The next morning, the hospital hallways were quiet. The sun had just started to peek through the blinds, casting long golden stripes across the linoleum floor. Ellie stood outside Tank's room, her engraved crutches steady beneath her hands. She had barely slept. Her eyes felt heavy, her heart felt full, and her hands were shaking just a little. Ruth had gone to get coffee. Rosie was down the hall making phone calls. For a moment, Ellie was alone. She took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The room was small and smelled like antiseptic. Machines beeped softly, their screens glowing with lines and numbers Ellie didn't understand. And there, in the bed, was Tank. He looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing she noticed. The big man who had stood like a mountain outside her school, who had lifted her off the ground so gently, now lay pale and tired, connected to tubes and wires. His graying beard was a little messy. His eyes were closed, but they fluttered open when the door clicked shut. "Ellie," he said, his voice hoarse and quiet. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're up early." She wanted to laugh, but instead, her eyes filled with tears. She moved across the room as fast as her crutches would carry her and dropped into the chair beside his bed. The folder she had been holding all night sat on her lap. She had looked through it again in the early morning hours. The bills Tank had paid, the school supplies he had covered, the medical equipment he had bought, all without a thank you, all without her ever knowing. "Hey," Tank said softly. "Don't cry. I'm right here." "That's the problem," Ellie whispered. Her voice cracked. "I almost lost you, just like I lost Dad. And I didn't even get to tell you." She stopped, pressing her lips together, trying to hold back the tears. Tank reached out a heavy hand and rested it on her arm. His fingers were warm. "Tell me what?" Ellie took a shaky breath. "Everything," she said. "I never got to thank you. For all of it. For the crutches. For standing outside my school. For being there when nobody else was. For honoring a promise you made to my dad even when you didn't have to." She looked down at the folder. "I found the paperwork. In your truck. All the things you paid for. All the ways you helped me and Aunt Ruth. I didn't know. I didn't know any of it." Tank's eyes softened. "You weren't supposed to know," he said quietly. "That's not why I did it." "I know," Ellie said. "That's what makes it so hard." She looked him straight in the eye, her voice trembling but strong. "I can't lose you, Tank. You're the closest thing I have to a father now. You're my family. And I never told you that. I never said it out loud." But it's true. The room was quiet except for the beeping of the machines. Tank blinked a few times, his throat moving as he swallowed. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Ellie," he said, "I'm not going anywhere. I promised your dad I'd watch over you. And I plan on keeping that promise for a long, long time." She let out a sob she had been holding in for hours. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him as best she could, careful of the wires, and he held her back with surprising gentleness for a man who had just been through so much. They stayed like that for a long moment. When Ellie finally pulled away, she wiped her eyes and let out a laugh. "You have to get better," she said. "The first scholarship ride is in 3 months. I need you in the sidecar." Tank smiled, a real smile, warm and steady. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Ellie sat with him for another hour, talking about nothing and everything. She told him about a book she was reading. He told her about a motorcycle he was building from scratch. The sun climbed higher, and the room grew brighter. When the nurse came in to check his vitals, Ellie stood up and hugged him one more time. "I'll be back later," she said. "I'll be here," Tank said. "Where else would I be?" She walked out of the room that afternoon, the crutches clicking softly against the floor. The heaviness in her chest had lifted. She felt lighter, like a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had finally been put down. She pulled out her phone and called Ruth. The line picked up. "Ruth?" Ellie said, and her voice was steady now, almost happy. "He's going to be okay. He's really going to be okay." There was a pause on the other end, and then Ruth let out a breath that sounded like a prayer answered. "Thank God," she whispered. Ellie smiled. For the first time in a long time, the sun felt warm on her face. Tank came home from the hospital on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, Ellie was knocking on his door. Doc had set up camp in Tank's small house behind the shop, turning the living room into a makeshift recovery station. There was a blood pressure cuff on the coffee table, a row of orange pill bottles lined up like little soldiers on the kitchen counter, and a schedule taped to the refrigerator with Doc's neat handwriting listing out medications and meal times. "He's not allowed to lift anything heavier than a coffee cup," Doc told Ellie the first day, only half joking. "And if you catch him near that garage, you call me immediately." Tank grumbled from his recliner, but he didn't argue. He looked tired those first few days, his color still pale, his big hands resting quietly in his lap instead of working on some engine part. But his eyes were bright whenever Ellie walked through the door. She came every day after school, her crutches clicking against the porch steps before she even knocked. Sometimes she brought homework and did it at his kitchen table while he napped. Sometimes she brought a book and read out loud, just to fill the quiet, and sometimes they just talked. It was during those quiet afternoons that Tonk told her more about her father. Not the polished version, not the surface stories she'd heard growing up. The real ones. "Your dad wasn't always sure he was doing right by you," Tonk said one afternoon, sitting up a little straighter in his recliner. "After your mom passed, he used to call me late at night. Couldn't sleep. Said he didn't know how to be a father and a mother at the same time." Ellie sat across from him, her homework forgotten on the table. "He never told me that." "He wouldn't have," Tank said. "He didn't want you to know how scared he was. He wanted you to feel safe, so he never let it show." He paused, looking at his hands. "But he loved you more than anything in this world, Ellie. Every decision he made, even the hard ones, even leaving the club, it was all for you." Ellie felt her throat tighten. "Why didn't he ever tell me about you? About any of this?" Tank was quiet for a moment. "I think he wanted you to have a normal life. A life without leather vests and motorcycle engines, and the kind of trouble that sometimes follows people like us. He wanted better for you, and when he made me promise to look out for you, he made me promise to do it quiet. From a distance. He didn't want the club life touching you unless it had to." "But it did," Ellie said softly. "It touched me in the best way." Tank smiled at that, and for a moment, the tiredness in his eyes lifted. "Yeah," he said. "I think he'd be glad about that." They sat with that for a while, the afternoon light slanting through the window, dust floating lazily in the beams. Doc puttered around in the kitchen, humming something under his breath, giving them space. On the 12th day, Tank seemed stronger. He sat up without wincing, and there was color back in his cheeks. Ellie noticed the change right away and grinned as she settled into her usual chair. "You're looking almost human again," she teased. "Almost," Tank said, chuckling. Then his face grew thoughtful, and he leaned forward slightly. "I've been thinking about something, while I've been sitting here doing nothing." "What's that?" "The scholarship fund. Your dad's name on it. We've been raising a little money here and there, but I think it's time we made it real. Official, I want to do a fundraiser ride. A big one. The whole chapter, other chapters too if we can get them. Charge an entry fee, get some sponsors, maybe a dinner afterward. Really launch it right." Ellie sat up straighter, her tiredness forgotten. "You mean like an actual event? With posters and everything?" "Posters, banners, the whole thing," Tank said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. What do you think? Ellie's mind was already racing. She thought of her father's name printed clean and proud on a banner. She thought of dozens of motorcycles lined up, engines roaring, all for something that mattered. She thought of kids like her, disabled kids who needed help but didn't know where to find it, finally getting a chance. "I think it's perfect," she said, her voice full of excitement. "I want to help. I want to help plan the whole thing." Tank's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." The month that followed felt like the busiest and best of Ellie's whole life. The clubhouse, once a place that had seemed a little scary to her, now buzzed like a beehive every afternoon. Long folding tables were set up along the back wall, covered in poster boards, markers, and stacks of flyers that Rosie kept printing at the copy shop downtown. A big corkboard hung near the door with a checklist pinned to it, growing longer every day. Ruth surprised everyone by taking charge of the food committee. She showed up with recipe cards and a determined look on her face, organizing a sign-up sheet for who would bring what to the after-ride dinner. "If 200 bikers are going to eat," she said, "we're going to feed them right." Nobody argued with her. Ellie had never seen her aunt so lit up, moving through the clubhouse like she belonged there, laughing with Rosie over pie crusts and casserole dishes. Rosie took Ellie under her wing for the harder parts. Together they called local businesses, asking for sponsorships. Some said no. But plenty said yes, once they heard the story. The hardware store donated supplies for a raffle. The diner offered a discount for anyone wearing an event t-shirt. A little bakery in town promised 200 cupcakes, free of charge, for Danny's girl. "You're getting good at this," Rosie told her one evening, watching Ellie hang up the phone after convincing a tire shop to sponsor the Finish Line banner. "You used to be so quiet." "I still am, mostly," Ellie said. "But this doesn't feel scary. It feels like it matters." Carla Jimenez ran a story in the paper every week leading up to the ride. The first one was about the scholarship itself, explaining what it was for and who it would help. The second told more of Danny Marsh's story, the version Ellie was only now learning, the version with laughter and loyalty and love folded into it. Carla interviewed Tank for that one, and when the article came out, Ellie cut it out and taped it inside her notebook, right next to a photo of her dad on his old motorcycle, young and grinning, years before she was born. Doc, still keeping a close eye on Tank's recovery, took charge of designing the posters himself. He wasn't much of an artist, but he knew engines, and he sketched a beautiful picture of a motorcycle with wings for the banner. Danny Marsh Memorial Scholarship Ride, printed underneath in bold letters. Ellie helped him pick the colors. Blue and silver, her mother's favorite colors, though she never told anyone that was why. By the third week, flyers hung in every shop window in Riverbend. People who used to whisper about the bikers now waved at them on the street. The whole town, it seemed, was getting ready for the ride. It was a Thursday evening, the sky turning orange and gold outside the clubhouse windows, when the door creaked open and everyone looked up. Braden Holt stood in the doorway. He looked different than Ellie remembered. Thinner, somehow, and older, even though it had only been a few months. His shoulders were hunched in, like he was trying to take up less space. He wasn't wearing his usual confident smirk. He looked scared. The room went quiet. Rosie set down her marker. Doc crossed his arms. Ruth's hand found Ellie's shoulder. "I finished the program," Braden said, his voice small. "The restorative justice thing. They said part of it is making amends." Actually doing something, not just saying sorry. He swallowed hard, looking at the ground. I was hoping I could help. With the ride. I don't need anything for it. I just want to do something right. For once. Nobody moved. Ellie felt her heart pounding, old hurt rising up fast and sharp, the memory of pavement under her hands, the sound of her crutches breaking, the laughter that had followed her for weeks after. But she thought of Tank, sitting in his recliner, telling her about Grace. She thought of her father, who'd left behind a hard life to build a soft one for her. She thought about what it meant to be given a second chance, and how she had been given so many by people who owed her nothing. She took a breath. Okay, she said. You can help. But you start with setup and cleanup, same as everyone else. No shortcuts. Braden looked up, surprised. Okay, he said quietly. Thank you. Saturday morning came bright and clear, the kind of blue sky that felt like it had been ordered special for the occasion. Riverbend's town square had never looked like this. Banners stretched between the lampposts, blue and silver letters spelling out Danny Marsh Memorial Scholarship Ride. Food stalls lined the sidewalk, filling the air with the smell of grilled corn and Ruth's famous casseroles. The bakery had come through on its promise, and 200 cupcakes sat under a striped tent, frosting glinting in the sun. But the real sight was the motorcycles. They stretched down Main Street in 2 long rows, chrome catching the light, leather saddlebags packed for the ride ahead. 200 of them, engines quiet for now, waiting. Riders stood beside their bikes in their colors. Some Ellie knew well by now. Some she was still learning the names of. It looked like an army. It looked like a family. Ellie stood near the ribbon that stretched across the starting line, red and shining, tied between 2 wooden posts Doc had built himself. She looked down at her crutches, the ones the club had given her, Danny Marsh engraved in careful letters on the metal, the chapter's insignia etched just below her grip. She had walked to this spot on her own, steady and sure, and she still felt a small thrill every time she realized how far she'd come. Beside her, Tank stood tall in his vest, a little thinner than before, his color back in his cheeks, his eyes bright. The heart attack had scared them all. But here he was, alive and solid and smiling down at her like she was the best thing he'd ever seen. You ready? He asked. I think so, Ellie said. You did all this, Tank said. You know that, right? You and Ruth and Rosie and everybody. But mostly you. Ellie shook her head, but she was smiling too. The mayor, a nervous-looking woman who had replaced Chief Holt after his resignation, handed Ellie a giant pair of scissors, the kind made for cutting ribbons at big events. Ellie held them in one hand, gripping her crutch with the other, and Tank placed his hand gently over hers to help steady the cut. The ribbon fell. The crowd cheered. 200 engines roared to life at once, a sound like thunder rolling across the square, and Ellie felt it in her chest, in her feet, in the handles of her crutches. It was the sound of something beginning. After the bikes pulled away for their ride around the county, circling back for the finish line dinner later that evening, the crowd gathered close around a small wooden stage that had been built near the gazebo. Ruth stood near the front, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. Rosie gave Ellie a thumbs up. Doc had his arms crossed, but he was smiling. Carla Jimenez stood near the back with her notebook, but, for once, she wasn't writing anything down. She was just watching. Ellie climbed the 2 steps to the small stage, her crutches finding their rhythm easily now, and looked out at the crowd. It was the whole town, it seemed. Faces she recognized from school, from the diner, from the hardware store. Faces that used to look away from her, and now looked right at her, waiting. She found the microphone, and her hands shook a little as she gripped it, but her voice came out steady. Almost a year ago, she said, a man I'd never met made one phone call. That's it. Just one call. He didn't know it would turn into 200 motorcycles standing outside my house. He didn't know it would turn into a scholarship or a town square full of people who care about kids like me. He just knew somebody needed help, and he decided to do something about it. She looked over at Tank, who stood near the edge of the stage, arms crossed, eyes glistening. I used to think family was something you were born into, Ellie continued. I know now that's not always true. Sometimes family is the people who show up. Sometimes it's one phone call rippling out further than anyone could ever imagine. She paused, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on the volunteer table near the food stalls, where Braden stood in a plain t-shirt, hauling folding chairs, listening quietly. He wasn't smirking. His eyes were wet. Kindness doesn't ask if you deserve it, Ellie said. It just shows up. And I hope, someday, all of us can be somebody's phone call. The square erupted into applause, the whole town rising to its feet, and Ellie stood there on the small wooden stage, crutches steady beneath her, feeling for the first time in a long time that she was exactly where she belonged. The sun had started to dip low by the time the last of the folding chairs got stacked away, painting the sky over Riverbend in streaks of orange and pink. The smell of grilled corn had faded into the cooler evening air, and the crowd had thinned to just the people who mattered most. Tank found Ellie by the food tent, wrapping the last cupcake in a napkin for Ruth to take home. Got one more thing for you today, he said. Ellie looked up. I think I've had enough surprises for one lifetime, Tank, he laughed, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. One more. Come on. He led her past the rows of parked motorcycles, most of them empty now, riders scattered around the square talking and laughing, until they reached his bike. It sat gleaming under the streetlight that had just flickered on, chrome catching the last of the sunset. And attached to the side, low and sleek, sat a sidecar Ellie hadn't noticed before. Wait, she said. Is that new? Doc and I put it on last week. Tank said. Been saving it. Figured today was the day. Ellie's mouth fell open. You built me a sidecar? Built it for you. Every bolt. He reached out and patted the leather seat like it was something precious. Your dad used to say a girl should never be scared of the open road. Figured it was time you found out what he meant. Behind them, Ruth had come up with Rosie and Doc, all three of them wearing the same soft, knowing smiles. Go on, baby, Ruth said, her voice thick. Go on and ride. Ellie looked at her crutches, then at the sidecar, then back at Tank. Doc stepped forward without a word and took her crutches gently from her hands, holding them like they were the most important cargo in Riverbend. Rosie gave her a wink. You've got this, Rosie said. Just like everything else. Ellie laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, and let Tank help her climb into the sidecar. The seat was low and snug, built just for her, with a little cushion Ruth must have helped pick out, soft blue fabric that matched the scholarship banners still fluttering over Main Street. Ellie settled in, gripping the edges, and felt a laugh bubble up out of her that she didn't even try to hold back. This is insane, she said. This is family, Tank said, swinging his leg over the bike and settling into his seat. Ready? Ready. All around them, engines began to roar back to life. 200 bikes lined up down Main Street just as they had been that morning, riders climbing on, colors catching the last light of the day. It looked like the whole club had been waiting for this exact moment. And maybe they had. Tank kicked his bike to life, the engine rumbling beneath Ellie like a heartbeat, and pulled out slowly, the whole formation falling into place behind them. Ruth stood on the sidewalk with Doc and Rosie, waving, her eyes shining with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. The bikes rolled out of the square and onto the open road that wound along the river, the water catching the orange light of the setting sun, the wind rushing past Ellie's face and pulling her hair back. She laughed again, louder this time, throwing her head back, feeling the road under her the way she never had before. Not stuck, not slow, not broken. Just moving. Just free. Behind them, 200 motorcycles followed in formation, their engines blending into one long, steady roar that echoed off the hills, a sound like something ancient and true. Ellie looked back once and saw them stretched out behind her, leather and chrome and steady hands on handlebars, every single one of them there because of a single phone call almost a year ago. Her father's memory did not live on in what had been hidden from her, in the secrets he kept or the life he left behind. It lived on in this. In every mile of road behind them, in every engine roaring in formation, in every hand that had reached out to catch her when she fell. It lived on in everything still being given. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.